Hi, all you super sensational cats. This is Miss Cardenas, and we are going to be talking about Chicana feminism in La Llorona. So, we're continuing with La Llorona, but remember when we went over monster theory, the monster's body is the culture of where it comes from. La Llorona, she changed after the civil rights movement, where you had Chicanos and Chicanas fighting for rights and against racism. So, a couple of things you need to know when we say Chicana, Chicano, or Chicanx. What this means is these are Mexican Americans. They're living here in the United States, and most Mexican Americans are mestizos, which means that because we're Mexican, we have the European blood of the colonizers and we have the indigenous blood of the people from the land, and that's in our ancestry. And the X at the end of Chicanx is meant to be gender neutral, so it's all inclusive, transgender, non-binary, for men or for women, because when you say Chicano, it leaves out the women. When you say Chicana, it leaves out the men. And then a couple of other terms. We're going to be talking about social justice, which is just asking for equality when it comes to education and wealth, job opportunities, health, and just any privileges within society that we should get, that everyone should get something the same, similar across board, that one person shouldn't have less rights or less access to something just because they're poor. And then we're going to talk about Atzlan. I say it wrong all the time. Atzlan. And that is the land that was once Mexican and now is part of the United States. And we're going to talk about it a little later in more detail because there's a map. Then there are the borderlands, and the borderlands are where Chicanxes live. We live on the border, most of us, between the United States and Mexico. And also metaphorically within us, we are the borderland because we are not Mexican, and there are still people who don't think that we are American, and so we're not accepted in either one, but we do have our own place here in the border, on the borderlands. And so within us, it's also the Mexican and the American, the two sides. The next one is machismo. And when we talk about machismo here, we're not talking about like, hey, machismo. No, we're talking about like that really aggressive masculine pride, aggressive masculine energy, where you use your manhood to control women or others who find inferior. Then we have decolonization. So that one, you have the word colonization. To colonize is to go somewhere and to take over. And to decolonize is to kind of like kick out the colonizers, but literally we can't kick them out of the land. So what that means is to reclaim our culture and heritage. And so sometimes it goes back to all the way the Aztecs and the Mayans. Sometimes it is just, from English to Spanish. We don't ask everyone to come out and speak Nahuatl. But we regain culture, and that's just when we go back to our Mexican roots. We look at our Aztec roots. You'll see people with their, the Mayan calendars, headdresses. So, looking at Aztec gods and goddesses and reusing those names as well. And then the last one is agency. And so this is just being in charge of yourself, being able to act in a way that's true to you. And agency is not just for Chicanos and Chicanas. Agency is part of the whole like social justice, but it's just having control over yourself and your body, and not having someone control you. So here we have the Chicano movement, El Movimiento of the 1970s. I am not going to go into a lot of detail. You just need to know the basics of it so that we can talk about how that movement changed La Llorona. And so we had, I mean, even today, it's still a problem, but there's racism against Chicanexes. It started becoming a problem in the Mexican American War of 1848. And so you have the Mexican border that used to be up in this red area, if you see my pointer, move all the way down here. And so there were Mexicans, mestizos, living in this area. Well, what happened to them when the U.S. took over? Well, the U.S. took their land. The U.S. didn't let them keep their land and then make them U.S. citizens. They took their land, gave it to white people, and then they treated the Mexicans like second-class citizens. And so a lot of them fell victim to poverty. And so this is where you have, the poor Mexican farm workers start because their land was taken from them. And so when in the 1970s, when this idea of Aztlan came about, Chicanos said that this whole red area was Aztlan. Then you have the Zoot Suit riots of 1943. It started with a murder after a party, and Jose Diaz was found murdered. At this party, there were a lot of Chicanos wearing zoot suits, and they said that it was juvenile delinquency running rampant in LA, and that was the cause of the murder. Newspapers got a hold of it, and they started, fear sells, and so they started reprinting this and, going to town with it. And then, you had the LAPD arrest 600 Chicanos. So 600, just because they had a skin color, like they were brown, or spoke Spanish, or were wearing a zoot suit. 4 of them were convicted of murder, and then the whole court case was just a circus. That's quoted somewhere. Can't remember which one I read it from, but they called it a circus. And the 4 zoot suiters who were convicted of murder were not allowed to shower. They were not allowed to change. They had to show up to court in their dirty suits with long hair. And of course, it fed into this idea of the juvenile delinquent. And so, of course, they were not given a voice, and they had no one who really cared to hear what they had to say. Eventually, their convictions got reversed, and while all of this was going on, you had the actual riots on the street. And this is where military men and white citizens began attacking anyone wearing a zoot suit, Chicanos, Asians, and then it was even Chicanos who were not wearing zoot suits, who were just minding their own business. And it was because during World War II, there were rations when it came to fabric. And the zoot suit, if you don't know what a zoot suit is, which I should have included a picture, but I didn't, it has like really billowy pants, and the jacket goes down to like the knees, sometimes kind of like mid-thigh, and so it's long and it requires, yes, a lot of fabric. And so they thought that when someone was out wearing a zoot suit, they were kind of being un-American and throwing it in the military's faces. And the military men, they stepped out of line. To attack citizens is just ridiculous. But instead of the LAPD arresting the military men and the white men, they arrested the Chicanos and the Asians who were victims. And then it got so bad that even some Mexicans or Chicanos were asking to just be put in prison or in jail so that the military men would not attack them. Skip all the way to the 1970s, and finally we have the civil rights movement. Everyone is tired of the racism and the injustice, and so we have a lot of protests. It was called El Movimiento, and in El Movimiento you had it start with grape workers in California going on strike. And so they wanted, again, like I said, better pay, better work conditions. They wanted better education for their children. They wanted the end to racism. And it was started by Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. And they asked the whole country to boycott grapes. And if I remember correctly from the articles that I read, it lasted about 5 years. So it was a long process, but eventually they did get better treatment for migrants, better healthcare, better pay, better living conditions. And then you have the students in the Hispanic or in the Chicano movement. They wanted better education, but they also just wanted better treatment. And so you have some young college students who got together and they created El Plan de Espíritu de Aztlán. Aztlán. And they got together at a conference in, I believe, Denver. And they created they wanted unity. If they had unity and they had one focus, then they'd be able to accomplish their goal. And so they created MECHA, which is El Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano de Aztlán, so the Chicano student movement of Aztlán. And then it ended up branching off to where there was a lawyer who was trying to reclaim the land taken from Mexicans after the Mexican-American War. And so they came up with a manifesto for mass mobilization, and they said that the key was nationalism. So they're saying that Chicanos needed to be their own thing. They needed to be Mexican, look to their indigenous culture, and they are American. And so they wanted to put a stop to being considered white. There was a push for a lot of Chicanos to be just considered white, that they were white themselves, but they said that wasn't going to work and they needed to be a united Chicano front. And so they wanted to push for better education, and it was led by Rodolfo Corky Gonzalez, and he wrote a poem called I Am Joaquin that's very, very popular, and one day we can read it, maybe, but I know they read it in English at our school. Then you had walkouts it was mostly in LA, but there were walkouts in other places. And from one of your history teachers, I talked to her. She said that there were walkouts even in Ed Cauchelsa that were, famous enough or got enough play to be on the news. So, in LA, you had over 10,000 students walk out, and their protest was over the educational system because in their classes were overpopulated, and because there was overpopulation, nobody was learning. And then there were lower graduation rates among Chicanos than there were whites, and they felt that there was a need for bilingual teachers and bilingual students, more Chicano teachers. And at the end, the school board did listen, and they did get bilingual classes and bilingual education and smaller class sizes. So kind of neat. And so while all of this was going on, women were part of the movement. Like I said, you had the Dolores Huerta, and they were protesting. The women who were going out and getting their education were a big part of the movement. And then they were like, okay, well, we have needs that we want to address, but the Chicano, El Movimiento, did not want to divide. They said, oh, once we get our things fixed, then we'll come to y'all next. And the women were like, I know what that sounds like. Too familiar. We're not going to wait. And so all of this happens because of the social norms. You have in the Mexican culture, you have men who were in charge of bringing home the money. They go out and they work, they bring home the money, and they're out on the streets, they go out, and of course this is, yes, still very similar to most traditions, except you have this idea of machismo. So they go out and they work and they drink and they do all these things, and the women stay home and they cook and they clean and they care for the children, and the men don't help with any of that. When the men come home, they want to be king of their realm. That's their home, they're the king, and even though the wife has been cooking and cleaning and caring for the children all day, once the father comes home, everyone needs to do what he says. And so she even has to do what he says. And so before colonization, indigenous women had more of a role in society than just caring for the home. You had, yes, your chief, but he had a council of women that he did have to listen to. And so a lot of the machismo was thought to come from the Europeans when they conquered. And then the mestizo and the indigenous men, they were being treated very poorly by the whites. And so then, or the Europeans. And so then they would come home and they'd want to be treated well and like kings. And sometimes they even took their frustrations out at home because they couldn't do it at work. And so that's where the machismo is thought to come from. And so we have this quote about the Chicana feminist movement. Sisters are working to develop a strategy that will enable us to be women, people, rather than chatals or pets. Women are considered by the traditional Mexican culture inferior beings. Their inferiority is constitutional and resides in their sex, their submissiveness, which is a wound that never heals. He does not attribute evil instincts to her. He even pretends she does not have any. It is impossible for her to have a personal, private life. For if she were to be herself, if she were to be mistress of her own wishes, passions, or whims, she would be unfaithful to herself. And so it's saying that this idea, the machismo, has been around for so long that women, they feel that if they ask for something or they do something for themselves, they feel like they feel wrong about it. Like it's not natural for them. Because Mexican women have always been submissive to their husband and do what he says. And then it's saying here that the men in the Chicano culture don't see women, married women, their wives, as evil. They don't see that she's bad or mean. She just, works and she should be a good woman. A submissive woman is a good woman. And so that is why we have Chicana feminism, because they were being ignored, because they were tired of being seen this way, because they were tired of not having a voice. They were tired of just being the rock and the helper to the men. They wanted social justice of their own. And so they were fighting for agency. There were cases where there were forced sterilizations of Chicana and Black women in poverty, and they wanted to fight against that there should be something in place so that if they were getting their tubes tied, they had to give consent, and if there was no consent given, then justice needed to be taken. And of course, they were fighting the Vietnam War. Their sons were going off and dying, and this was still part of the big El Movimiento. But Chicanas, in their feminist movement, they pushed for more unity. Their feminist movement was different than the white feminists, because the white feminists were asking for something that middle class and, rich white people wanted, um, white women wanted, versus the needs of a of the women in poverty stricken areas. What are their needs? They need better healthcare, childcare. They need better women's care and sex education. And so there were all of these needs that the marginalized groups, Native American, Black, Asian women, and the gay community needed that they were not getting. And so, because these Chicanas wanted a voice and they were asking for something more, something apart from what the bigger movimiento was doing, um, Chicanas who fought for their rights as women were called malinchistas, or betrayers to the causes of la raza. So they were called traitors. The Chicana feminists were shamed, and because they wanted their own voice. And so here, this comes from Domino Rene Perez, and we'll talk about her book later. So, a malinchista, well, comes from Malinche, and we're going to ask ourselves, who's Malinche? And we've already heard about her before because we talked about Malinche when it came to, or actually you heard about her from the first Monstrum video for La Llorona, and she was an indigenous Nahua woman. She was given to Hernan Cortez as an offering. So she was taken from her family, or her family gave her up, and then she was given to Cortez. And she was one of 20 women, and she became his lover. She had his child, and then she was a translator between Cortez and the indigenous. And then she was blamed ultimately for the conquest of her indigenous people. They said that the reason that her people were wiped out was because of her. So, rather than place the blame at the feet of the colonizers where it belongs, history favors the villainization of a remarkable woman. So, we have the Chicana feminism's effect on La Llorona. So, okay, we've been talking about the movement. We've been talking about what's going on with the Chicano, the Mexican American culture, but where does La Llorona come in? And here's where she comes in. So, how does she fit in? And so, if you guys don't remember who La Llorona is, you need a refresher of La Malinche, or if you need a refresher of Malinche, just click this little guy over here, and he'll take you to the Monstrum video in like 1 second. There we go. And so it should pop up here. So there's a book called There Was a Woman, La Llorona, from folklore to pop culture, and this book has everything La Llorona. And so it was written by Domino Rene Perez, and she wrote the book on the historical, social, cultural analysis of La Llorona and how she changed. And so all the information from here, pretty much to the end, is from her book. So, you have Chicano culture traditionally has tended to polarize the lives of women. So we have women are either mujeres buenas or mujeres malas, or la mal mujer. And so there is no middle ground. And so in Chicano culture, Mexican culture, you are either la virgen or you're La Llorona, and this is another depiction of Malinche. And Llorona and Malinche are mujeres malas, And la Virgen is the mujer buena, everything. She cares for children, she has love, she watches over, she's a guardian. La Llorona, she goes out in the night and she looks for children and she drowns them and she drowned her own children and she's cursed. Malinche, she's the one who's the reason that we were conquered. And so you have this like strange dichotomy. You have, this woman who is idolized because she possesses all of the good qualities of a submissive woman, and these women who were left pretty much by the men, and they had to figure out how to live their life. So, two names, one woman. Some scholars think that La Llorona is Malinche because of the similarities in their stories. You have two, a poor or an indigenous woman. La Malinche and La Llorona fall in love with a rich stranger. So Cortés, or the rich stranger, right? They have his male child. He leaves her for a woman of his class or reasons of wealth. So with Malinche, Cortés took the child they had together and he went back to Spain and he left her. He actually gave her away to one of his captains. And so what do the women do? They take revenge by drowning their children. This really did not happen to Malinche. There's no proof that Malinche drowned her children. She was separated from them. And like I said, Cortés took his child back to Spain and Malinche was given to another man. And so there is that separation. She could still be crying for her children because they were taken from her, not because she drowned them, but we don't know. So then this comes to, now we're getting out from history and we're getting out from legends and we're looking at Llorona the monster. And so here, when it comes to monsters, we talk about fear and we talk about culture. And so, again, we're going back to Cohen and monster theory. And the monster's body is the cultural body, which just means that the things that you find in the monster, those are things that are important or scary for the culture. And so La Llorona, she is a tool for discipline. If you misbehave, La Llorona is going to come for you. And so she's the behavior police. And as a warning, she warns kids, from wandering far from home. She warns women and children about evil mothers. That women, if you fall in love with the wrong man, you could become an evil mother. Or children, if you misbehave, there's, the possibility that your mother could drown you. For boys, La Llorona appears as a temptress. And for women, it is saying that sexuality leads to tragedies. In some cases, she goes against what her parents say and she goes and marries the, stranger rich man. The man leaves. There's some where she doesn't care, she doesn't get married, she becomes a mistress, and then this is what happens to her. And so there's some where she's jealous of her children. Either way, this putting such a heavy emphasis on men and the relationship with men leads to tragedy. And so it's telling the girls to be careful of outsiders. Don't marry anyone outside your class and don't marry anyone outside your race. And then we have her breaking the rules. And so again, Cohen, the monster dwells at the gates of difference. And so monsters are different. They are outsiders. They are rule breakers. And so what makes her break the rules? How does she break the rules? She marries an outsider. She breaks the rules. So because she married an outsider, she's not sticking to her own kind, and this is why bad things happen. She kills her children. That's another big no-no. Infanticide. Infanticide. I'll pronounce it right one of these days. Is a taboo. You don't kill your own children. You don't kill innocent children. Not your own or anybody's children, right? This is her going against her female role. She's not taking care of the home. She's not putting her family first. Again, she is an evil mother. She's cursed. And so God punishes her for breaking these rules. And she's still searching. And so it's just saying that women who step out of line, who don't act like a, mujer buena, they will never find peace. They're destined to be like La Llorona. And so then, again, you have the Chicana feminists looking at La Llorona and all of these things that are associated with her, and they feel that this is a way, that her story is a way for men to keep women in their place. And so they want to give La Llorona a voice, because the tale villainizes women who don't fit the stereotype. So if you are not a good woman, you are like La Llorona. It depicts a woman who's powerless against man. So she's powerless against a man, and so she murders for revenge. And so you should accept your powerlessness, because if you don't, then you're going to become an evil, murderous mother, a bad woman. You should be ashamed of yourself. And then it discourages women from seeking independence and sexual agency. La Llorona, rather than being by herself, she kills her children because there's, nothing else to do. And so, according to the story, when a woman does not have a man, then she has no worth. The inclusion of La Llorona in the oral narratives and cultural productions of Greater Mexicans represents not only her prominence as a cultural figure of femininity, but her potential to evolve beyond traditional feminine constructs. Specifically, she is a figure of mourning that weeps for the losses Chicanas and Chicanos have sustained in contemporary mainstream American culture, especially women who suffered gender as well as ethnic oppression. She is at the same time a figure of revolt against those same losses. So here you have Perez saying that La Llorona in the contemporary light, she is breaking the role of a traditional Mexican female. What she's crying for is not for the loss of her 2 boys that she murdered, but it's for the losses of the Chicanas and the Chicanos. She's weeping because of the treatment of them. And then she's weeping for her fellow women who have suffered ethnic oppression. And she's a revolt against all of the things that keep a woman repressed. So, if you look at this picture, I found a strong woman. She doesn't have the long flowy hair like your traditional Llorona would. She's wearing black, not white. She's in a tough, position. She's got jewelry and a shawl, and she's out, not in the night, but at dusk. And so a contemporary rendering might include some traditional elements. Yes. So in the contemporary stories, you may have a woman who's sobbing, and that might be La Llorona. You may have, you may have a woman who's searching. You may have this idea of loss and searching. You may have an idea, so there's vengeance or refusing traditional Chicana social norms. And because she's refusing the social norms, she may be compared to La Llorona. Sometimes there's a river, sometimes there's not. Most of the time there are tears. Of course, with La Llorona, even in the contemporary re-imaging of her, which we are going to read, the hard thing to get past is the infanticide, is killing her kids. That is the hard thing to overlook. And so you have um, artists, whether they are painters, playwrights, writers, movie makers, and they try to kind of get around this. If she still is, killing a child in the end of the story, then they try to explain her decision that she's not killing her children, she's killing a part of herself, or that she's in killing her kids, she's trying to save them from poverty or a life of injustice or from becoming their father. Um, or they try to show that before all of this happened, she was a good mother. That before her husband left, she tried to be the best mother she could. Sometimes she works several jobs and tries to keep everyone afloat, but there's a breaking point for women. Or sometimes they make her childless. So she's, crying for the loss of her people. Um so she could be a childless woman, or because she has no children, she chose something else instead of children. She cries for her choice. You know, if women choose a career over a family, like, the time passes them by, and why does it have to be one or the other? So, or it could be a metaphorical. She could be a metaphorical Llorona. She's could be a river. She could be the land. She could be the mother of all Chicanos. She can weep for those lost to drugs and violence. Or there are more contemporary who question the father. Like, why did the father leave? Why did he cheat? What's going on? If he didn't leave, then the kids would be okay. Or if, he paid his child support. I really don't know. But there are other versions of La Llorona. And in different ones, they try to get her side of the story. She's not just evil all of the time. Sometimes her body changes, sometimes her intentions change, sometimes she's not what you expect. And so La Llorona continues to speak to Chicanexes because she is the eternal mother who refuses to give up on her children. We, in turn, look to her to symbolize or articulate our contemporary reality. By continuing to imagine La Llorona, we revitalize the legend and create new conversations about our cultures and communities. So, when La Llorona stops becoming a monster, she stops becoming something that's feared, and you have this idea that independent women are not something to fear, they're something to aspire to. And so, of course, my information is not just from the top of my head, but I did read a lot of things and watch history, because I'm not a history person, in order to get some of the background for the culture and the cultural movements that were happening that helped change La Llorona.